Do words have any meaning? How do we communicate? There's a great deal of confusion in our modern society as people talk past each other, and words change meaning very quickly. How do we deal with that? Most of us can't keep up with the way words change, with the wokeness of it, and we're worried, will we get cancelled for using words that were acceptable just a few years ago? And does it really matter?
Yeah, Steve, it does, because I just read that 2 + 2 is 4 is actually a white Western oppressive construct. Oh, and somebody else was telling me that there's no such thing as reality, to which point I said, I don't think you're real, so I can't talk to you, and block them. Yeah. But what's the secret for us in this kind of stuff? It's to be honest, it's to find real meaning, and it's ultimately to realize that truth comes from the one who is the truth. Okay, I am going to introduce you. Well, I'm sure you've seen this. This is probably my all-time favorite advert. And if you're German, I forgive you for the racism, or you forgive me for the racism. Enjoy this.
Das hier ist mein Sektor. Das hier ist das wichtigste Gerät des Küstenwächters. Das Gerät, Überlebensradar. Mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you... Over. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We are sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
Steve, are you amused? Or are you German?
What were you thinking? I don't know. I want to know, was that guy actually German? Because if he wasn't allowed to act as a German naval officer, according to the latest laws coming out of Hollywood. But thinking about language, there's obviously, that's dangerous to think that he's thinking, not sinking. But can you name one major misunderstanding that you've experienced because of a misuse of language and where language has been used at cross purposes?
Yeah, this was really important because we did a questionnaire around our area, around the church, and we put on it, one of the questions was, do you believe that Jesus is the Son of God? And you put 1 if you agreed and 5 if you disagreed. Now we had questions like, do you believe that God is the creator, and so on? And about 10% of people in the area were Muslim. And they agreed with most of the statements. But the Jesus is the Son of God one, it was like 5 disagree with expletives and crosses and everything. And the reaction was, and I went to a friend of mine and said, what's going on here? I mean, I know they didn't think Jesus was the Son of God, but why are they so strong? And he said, oh, David, you're an idiot. And I said, well, tell me something new. He said, you've just asked them, do you believe that God the Father had sex with the Virgin Mary and thus produced Jesus? I said, that's gross. And he said, exactly, but that's what you've asked them.
Yeah.
So I was using Son of God in the Christian sense and in the biblical sense, and they heard something different. Now, that's fairly major, but that can happen in lots of different ways, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's language at cross purposes. And you think of the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis, where language gets confused. And I don't expect that means that everyone suddenly spoke French and Spanish, but the way they used language started to diverge in meaning and understanding. They didn't have a common understanding of what they were talking about. Mm-hmm. Do you think that we're heading towards another kind of Tower of Babel experience where people are trying to do things together, but they can't because they can't form community because we're not speaking in common ways with each other?
Yeah, I think the person who controls the language controls the culture, and I think it is becoming a power issue. I think the postmodern use of language is extremely destructive. But I'll give you another example. What does the word faith mean?
Trust. That's what I'm going to say. Can I say that, David?
You can say that. But the dictionary definition is very interesting. I did a study of this, and before about the last decade of the 20th century, the word faith rather, did mean trust. It meant, in fact, in the Christian context, it meant belief in because of the evidence. But Richard Dawkins and co., by the time you get to 2010, in every dictionary, faith means belief without, or belief contrary to the evidence or without evidence. In other words, it's blind faith. And Christianity has never, ever taught that. And that taught me a big lesson just observing that, because I think language is becoming extremely confused. People don't know what they're supposed to say or what they're not supposed to say, what is offensive and what is not offensive. So I think that our use of language, it's interesting. I think our language has to be increasingly precise, and often, especially, we need to ask, what do people mean by this? So what are they asking? Because often people are coming from different cultural contexts. And even within Western society, the common language is, I think, being diffused.
So what's the connection between language and thinking and our thought processes? How does that work?
You can't think without language. Thinking involves rational process. Language is fascinating because human beings have language, animals don't. They have means of communication, but we have language that puts words together to describe things, many other things as well, I think.
Yeah.
So you don't think without language, and if you abuse language, you're going to end up not thinking.
Yeah. There's a great New Yorker cartoon where there's a dog speaking to another dog, and he says, it's great. I shout at him, and then he shouts at me, and then I shout back at him. So the dog's obviously got another understanding of what's going on compared to the human. But how can we have a better conversation? Because I do think we're speaking at cross purposes with each other. There is kind of a Babel, a thing going on. If you saw that movie a few years ago too about Babel, just different understandings of what's going on. How in our culture, given all the things that are tearing it apart, how can we have a better conversation?
Well, it's interesting you use the dog thing, because I think that's what a lot of social media is. I think it is people shouting at one another and there's no conversation. So actually using the word conversation, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's kind of like the hip liberal progressive thing to say, let's have a conversation.
Yeah.
But bizarrely, we're having less conversations.
Oh, everything is much shorter. Like everything has been reduced to a meme. Yeah. And that's a hard thing. Like even humor today, humor from 50 years ago doesn't seem funny to people today because it's not snappy, immediate, and nowadays it's just one or two words and you feel everything in around it, don't you?
Yeah. I mean, I think what we're doing just now is we're having a conversation.
Well, you keep thinking that, David, because I think this is just a one-way monologue.
but I mean, much to our producer Janelle's, I mean, we just never stick to script because we don't have a script. We're having a conversation. And, I had somebody around last night and they were around at our house for 2.5 hours. We had a meal, we had a conversation. It was just great. And I think better conversations involves at least this. It involves listening to people. It involves engaging with people. It involves respecting and loving people. In fact, the Bible verse I would take would be out of Ephesians. Speak the truth in love. So there are people who say they're going to be loving, but they don't speak the truth. Yeah. And then there are people who may speak the truth, but it's not in love.
Well, I think I've seen a bit of that.
Yeah, I know you see a lot of it. But I find that conversation can be enormously stimulating. I actually find talking to myself is not that stimulating.
Okay, Dave, give us an out to go into this week, because I think one of the things we've got to do is say, what is going to change about me this week in the hundreds of conversations I have, whether they're online or with people? Give me one thing to go away with from this morning from the kitchen table.
Okay, very simple. If you find yourself getting in an argument online, stop it and say to the person, look, if you're near me, well, I mean, you're in Perth, so nobody's near you, but so if you're in Perth, then you say, why don't we meet for a coffee to continue this? So I would often say to people, or I would say, let's take this offline. Let's write each other. But mostly I would just simply say this. I remember having a debate or receiving an extremely strong email from a transgender activist. And I said, no, let's not do this. Let's meet up. and we met up, and at the end we were almost hugging, you know. So that would be my takeaway. My takeaway would be, decide this week to have a conversation with someone who you really need to have a conversation with. Just a chat, not trying to sort the world, you know.
What are we going to do next week, Dave?
We are going to go to the dining table, because
right.
we're going to have our good friend John Lennox, who we could have a conversation with him for 3 hours, and he is the only guy I know who could outtalk you.
Good Northern Irishman. Okay, that's it. I've finished my coffee. I've finished my kitchen table experience. See you next week at the dining table, Dave.
Yeah, see you next week. Bye.